So I was thinking about brewing a Saison. I was also thinking about brewing a Kölsch. Well, what if I could brew one batch, 2 different yeasts, and get 2 different beers? What if I threw in a third one, a Belgian Single? Well, hey there, my name is Brent. Thanks a lot for stopping by Cascades Homebrew. So I brewed quite a few batches of Saison over the years. I was thinking about brewing a Kölsch. I was looking at some recipes and I thought, wow, a lot of these recipes look very similar to what I might use for a Saison. So often for a Kölsch recipe, I was seeing a base of Pilsner, maybe with some wheat in there, just a simple grain bill, kind of some European hops, fairly low on the bitterness. So the Brew Club's quarterly beer was a Saison. So I wanted to brew one of those, put the pack of Belle Saison they sent me to use. But I also thought maybe I could brew a big batch, an 11-gallon batch, split that up, and also do one with a Kölsch yeast, so Lallemand Köln, maybe do another one with Abbaye yeast, Lallemand Abbaye yeast, and try to get 3 different beers out of one brew day. Before we get in the recipe, I probably want to note it's probably a little better Saison-ness recipe, or at least it was tweaked to be more of a Saison, with some ideas that maybe it'd be flexible. But for a Kölsch, well, it came in a little higher gravity, a little higher ABV. I think the late hops additions were probably more than what I've seen in a typical Kölsch recipe. So as far as a Belgian Single recipe, well, I don't know, Belgian Singles are kind of hard to come by, especially here in the United States. It's not a beer I've tried very much. I think it's a pretty solid recipe. I think that would work pretty well for a Belgian Single. So a big part of my motivation for the recipe here was a simple beer that would really showcase the yeast differences. In this case, I'm using this Belle Saison yeast for a Saison. I'm using a Lallemand Köln yeast for a Kölsch style beer. And then I'm using Lallemand Abbaye yeast to make a Belgian Singlish type beer. So I've never used that Köln yeast before, and I've never actually brewed a Kölsch style beer myself. It's a beer of the style that I'm kind of growing more fond of lately. As far as Lallemand Abbaye, I've made several beers lately with that yeast. I made a blonde a while back. I made a double. I made a triple. I'm not 100% sure how much I like that yeast compared to what was my go-to, which was WLP 530, the Westmalle strain before that. So I thought this would be a good chance to really kind of showcase what does that yeast give to a beer. So at some point it'd be interesting to do a side-by-side with the Lallemand Abbaye dry yeast versus the WLP 530 liquid yeast from White Labs. So quick note, one thing is fun. I took these 3 beers and I put them in a competition. So we're going to talk about those scores when we come back. Okay, so let's just take a quick look at the brew day, the recipe, and then come back and taste the beer and look at those competition score results. So this is my second time brewing 11 gallons of wort in my 15-gallon kettle. My prior video had more detail of the process, so I won't go into too much detail here, but basically, I need to hold back enough of the mash water to use as a sparge, so I haven't fit it all into my kettle for the mash. So I start the brew day by setting up my propane burner here on my back patio. I called this one Divisions, because I divided it up. Really funny name, huh? So I got a Saison, a Kölsch, and a Belgian Single out of this one batch. 11-gallon batch. The bitterness was calculated at 41 IBUs, and then the color at 3.8 SRM. So I wonder a little bit about the bitterness. Some of the competition feedback I got was it was kind of low. You would think at that level of bitterness that wouldn't be the case. I don't know. It could be the calculations are just a little bit off. So I calculated the recipe around a 75% efficiency. I do kind of find with a low gravity beer and a sparge, I get a higher efficiency, so I did come in a higher gravity than this, but I was targeting 1048, kind of a final gravity of 1009, although it would vary by different yeasts. But at those gravity numbers, it would have been about a 5.2% ABV beer. Like I said, I came in above that. So for these larger batches, I measure out the combined mash and sparge water. To do that, I add 1 crushed Camden Temple. Ooh! So I find it's just maybe a little easier to measure and treat the full amount of water versus the mash and sparge water separately. So for this one, I need 14.7 gallons or 55.7 liters of my tap water. From that, I separate 4 gallons of water that I'm going to use for the sparge. So that 4 gallons or 15.1 liters of tap water for the sparge gets treated with some lactic acid, 1.5 milliliters. So I've got 9.4 gallons or 35.6 liters of my tap water for the mash. So I treat that with 11.5 milliliters of lactic acid. I'm trying to hit a mash pH of 5.4. So I also add 5 grams of gypsum. I'm keeping the water adjustments pretty minimal here, but I think a little bit of extra calcium and sulfate maybe help this batch a little bit. So here's the water profile. Again, it's not that critical, but I do like to try to boost my calcium up 50 or above. And that brings my sulfate up to about a 2-to-1 ratio. It's about an 80-to-40. Looking at the grain bill on this one, got Pilsner, some white wheat, and melanoidin malt. So about 87% of Bohemian Pilsner malt, which is a nice flavorful Pilsen malt. I got about 10% of a white wheat malt, and then just under 3% of melanoidin malt. I think I'm saying that right. I got the Weyermann melanoidin malt. So I don't think I've ever used melanoidin malt. I've been curious about using it. I think it might just give a little bit of color, a little bit of grain complexity to a beer like this. So I decided to mash this one at 159 degrees Fahrenheit or 65 degrees Celsius for 60 minutes. That should give me a pretty fermentable wort. So at the end of the 60-minute mash, I go ahead and pull out and hang the grain bag. I give it a good squeeze to get out the majority of that sweet wort, and then I move the grain bag over to my 10-gallon kettle for the sparge. I add in the sparge water and give it a good stir. Then, 10 minutes later, I come back for another stir, squeeze to get out that wort. So my target pre-boil volume is 13.4 gallons. And it looks like I'm right on target for that. So at the start of the 60-minute boil, I add in 2.2 ounces or 62 grams of Syrian Goldings. That should give me 17.4 IBUs. Note, with a limited headspace in this batch, it's pretty important to keep an eye out for a boil-over. If you're a new brewer, those boil-overs can really sneak up on you quick. Then with 10 minutes left in the boil, I add 2 ounces of Styrian Goldings, which give me about 7 IBUs in theory. With the 60-minute boil complete, I use my immersion chiller, try to get down to close to pitching temperatures. So even with circulating ice water through that, with these large batches with a lot of hot wort, I could only get it down to about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, about 27 degrees Celsius. I guess I need to plan for more ice during the summer when my tap water is so warm when I'm doing a large batch. So I ended up just using my fermentation chamber to get the batches down to my desired pitching temperatures. So I start off by splitting the wort in a pair of 3-gallon Fermonster fermenters. I then fill up another 3-gallon Fermonster and then my 3.5-gallon brew bucket. I measured an original gravity of 1056, so that applies to all the different batches. So looking at the different yeasts, so the Lallemand Belle Saison, so I had 2 fermenters, each with about 2.7 gallons or about 10.2 liters of wort. To those, I split 1 pack and I divided it into each fermenter. So I fermented one of those at a fairly normal room temperature, say 75 degrees Fahrenheit. And the other, the goal, was to ferment it hotter. So looking at the attenuation on both batches, they both got down really close to 1.001. So it gave me about 7.2, 7.4% ABV on those Saisons. So looking at the Lallemand Abbaye batch, so I had 1 fermenter with about 2.7 or 10.2 liters of wort. So I direct pitched some harvested slurry. This was harvested just a few weeks prior. That one fermented also, kind of at a room temperature, 75 degrees Fahrenheit, 24 degrees Celsius. The attenuation on that one brought it down to a 1010. It's gave me about a 6.1% ABV. It's a Lallemand Kölsch yeast. So again, I had this one another about 2.7 gallons of wort. I direct pitched the 1 pack. I fermented that one cooler, so 62 degrees Fahrenheit, 17 degrees Celsius. The attenuation was very similar to the Abbaye batch, so I brought it down to 1011, so I had about a 6%, so that's a little high for a Kölsch. So here I am with the 3 beers. So I was recently at 1812 Brewery out in Cumberland, Maryland, picked up this, what is it called, the Stans, the typical Kölsch glass. So I figured I need to use that for this beer. The beer in the middle is the Belle Saison fermented batch, and on the end is the Lallemand Abbaye. So off the bat, I can see that the Belle Saison was a little hazy. This one was bottle conditioned. The other 2 were in a keg. And I filled them from bottles that had been filled off the keg. So I don't know if it's the yeast making the difference, but the Belle Saison one definitely has quite a bit of haze to it. The Lallemand Abbaye one is crystal clear right now. The Kölsch one, still hanging on to a bit of a haze to it. It's almost clear, but it's not crystal clear. So I don't want to get bogged down too much with tasting 3 different beers. But one thing I would say, there's definitely quite a bit of difference between these beers. You definitely notice that there's some similarities between them, just because they do have the same grain bill, the same hops. Some of that kind of grain character and hop character kind of runs between the 3. But with the different yeast characters, they're all fairly distinct beers. So let's start tasting the single and looking a little bit at the competition. So I entered these 3 beers into the Dominion Cup 2023 competition. This has had 500 entries in it. It's one of the entries for the Master Homebrew Program circuit. So there's a lot of really good brewers. It filled up pretty quick. So I think it's a pretty competitive competition. So looking at my notes here, so the single beer scored a 36 overall. That's a pretty good score. So I got 1 sheet, it was a 37, one was a 34. So one judge says, so a beautiful table beer, could be improved by focus on the carbonation. So since it was kegged, and as I have run all my kegs at the same, it probably wasn't at that high level what a Belgian beer should be. So that's probably valid. It says no off flavors. I think that was probably the judge that gave it the higher score. The other one said right flavor components, possibly fermented too warm. I'm not sure that's the case, but maybe the yeast gives some characters of that. It says phenolics present go beyond clove and more toward a plastic or medicinal profile, less pronounced after it warmed a bit. The malt and hop contributions are pleasant, and the judge says could take a little more bitterness to cut some of the sweetness. All right, so how does the taste compare with that? I definitely get sweetness. I get maybe a little bit of apple, a little bit of clove in there, a little bit of I think a little bit of kind of classic. I think it's probably what I like to look in this style. Again, this one, I think 6.1% ABV. It's maybe a little high for a single, but it's not too far out of the style guidelines. So again, I think the base recipe is probably pretty on track for what this style is. It's a good drinking beer, something a little different. I'm not 100% sure how much I really love this beer. But again, I thought it was a good showcase for the Abbaye yeast. And I do like that yeast. I think I might like WLP 530 a little bit better. But in this particular beer, it's hard to tell. Like I said, I definitely would like to do WLP 530 versus Abbaye. There's actually a couple other Belgian dry yeast too that I'm wanting to try. But overall, it's a really nice beer and I enjoy it. So moving on to the Kölsch style beer. This one scored a 35 overall. Again, pretty good score. They moved on to the mini best of show for that style category, but didn't advance from there. So you had two sheets. They both gave it the 35 from both judges. So one of the notes from the first judge said, very good example of a Kölsch. Could be improved by softening and rounding the palate. Okay, I'm not quite sure what that means. A lot more comments from the second judge. Well-made beer, pleasant malt character. Says bitterness is a little low. Plastic and yeast character presented as it warmed. I don't know, maybe that's kind of a flaw on my end. Be mindful of fermentation temps to alleviate this potential issue. So I think for this one, I fermented it pretty well what I understand for that Kölsch yeast you're supposed to ferment. Maybe I could keep it a little colder or go a little colder. I mean, it really hasn't been lagered. Like, I think that's one of the things that it's an ale yeast that's fermented kind of cool, but then there's a lagering period. And I just kind of had it in my kegerator for, the couple months before the competition. Interesting said, increasing mash temp could do a little more body to fit the guidelines, which is kind of interesting because I thought maybe it's a little bit more body, especially it's definitely up there in gravity and ABV for the style. But this is a beer that I just, I really like drinking. I really am starting to like Kölsch beers a lot on tap. That I kind of, when I look at the menu and they have a Kölsch, I've been ordering those a lot more. So I'm not a huge, say, like pale lager drinker. And a Kölsch kind of is on the edge of that ale lager. It's a hybrid. It's got enough flavor, a little yeast flavor in it that I think it kind of gets that flavorful component that I really like. But also be crisp and clean. So how does this one taste? It's really nice, crisp and clean and drinkable beer. It's got that grain character shows up more in this one. Like I said, I think compared to commercial Kölsches I've had, it's just got a little more hop character, a little more grain character. It's just kind of, I know the stats on it, so I know that it's kind of big in ABV. But it definitely has more flavor, I think, than maybe the commercial Kölsches that the traditional Kölsches have. But again, as far as like competition beer versus just a really nice drinkable beer, it's really nice. I think I'll do something very similar. Probably just lower the wheat down or maybe even remove the wheat. Just try to bring the ABV down into that 4.8 or so percent to get it in the style guidelines. I think this would be a really nice beer. So I'm going to try to cycle back and brew another Kölsch here soon. All right, and then the Saison. So this was originally the recipe, I think, was geared toward a Saison. So this one scored same competition, scored a 36. So really in the same general. I think what did we get? 37 and we got a 36 and a 35 from the other one. So 36. So all of them scored within a point or two of each other. It's kind of interesting. Exact same wort, fermented with 3 different yeasts. This one I had 3 sheets. It was a 34, a 36, and a 38. So that's a little bit of a range. 38's a pretty high score. So and this one actually went on to that mini best of show and then placed 3rd in the category. Again, it's a pretty competitive competition to place 3rd. So they must have thought it. So I actually entered the one that was fermented hotter. The one that I'm drinking here is the one that was fermented a little cooler. I've got this cooler fermented one going into a competition. I just dropped the entries off. I think it was just yesterday. So it'll be interesting to see the score of that one, how that comes back. It's kind of hard to tell between scores and placement across competitions, but it'll be interesting to see how they do. So some of the notes on this one: estery nose, bready malt character as it warms. Hops come across a bit sharp, somewhat metallic on the tongue, takes away from the phenolic aspects of the beer. Another judge said very cohesive beer. Ester profile of bubblegum, kind of overpowers a little bit of the malt character. Okay. The beer is also slightly malty on balance compared to traditional. May want to increase the bittering hops. Adjusting fermentation temps or reducing pitch rates would potentially fine tune it in. I'm not quite sure if he's saying lower it, because that one was fermented pretty hot. And the other judge said, well done, fermentation produces great esters. For style, it could use more hop bitterness. Again, there was, I think we saw that maybe it was the Kölsch, somebody said maybe a little more bitterness. 2 judges said for the Saison a little more bitterness. So I wondered a little bit about those IBU calculations. So one of the judges says, so a couple more IBUs and bittering charts, and this would score in the 40s. So that's kind of an interesting comment. So in the past, I've never been a massive fan of, say, Belle Saison, but this one has really been an enjoyable beer to drink. I don't know if it's just the combination of the malt bill, just that kind of flavorful Pilsner with the melanoid in there. Styrian Golding tops, too. That's something that I bought specifically because I was going to start using that in a Saison versus some of the German hops I've been using in Saisons before. So I think a lot of that just really comes together, and I'm really happy with this recipe. I think the Belle Saison actually, turned out pretty well in this one. So I'm, like I mentioned, so I split the Belle Saison into 2 fermenters. Fermented one of them. The goal was, kind of a room temperature, around 75 degrees Fahrenheit, whatever that is in Celsius. And then the other one, the goal was to kind of ferment it hotter. It actually got out really hot. So we're going to come back. It actually got up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the middle of fermentation. And that was a beer that scored, won a medal. So that was pretty interesting. So I'm hoping my next video looks a little closer at those Saisons, the different fermentation temperature. Look at the little difference between the two. As I say, I just put that in a competition, so I want to get those scores back before I put that video together, so we can kind of compare some of the judges' feedback between the hot fermented and the cool fermented. Overall, I'm really happy with the way this turned out. It was pretty interesting to create 3 fairly distinct beers out of 1 brew day. So I definitely would encourage, if you want to try to fit in more, like different variety, but you don't have very many brew days, if you can try to step up your batch size and then try different yeasts, maybe just do, like, if you have the equipment to do 10-gallon batches and then do 2 5-gallon batches, or in the case where I often do, a 5-gallon batch and I split it in half with 2.5-gallon batches. That's also a great option to try to just mix up that variety on tap. All right, so I've got some beer to drink, and these are all really good. But if you're interested in learning about that Saison, or if you're interested about more experimental, brew in the bag, simple stuff like that, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And cheers.